बिस्मिल्लाहिर्रहमानिर्रहीम, अस्सलाम वालेकुम। मैं हूं मोहम्मद साकिब और आप देख रहे हैं मेरा यूट्यूब चैनल कदर टॉक्स। माइकल कुगेलमैन अमेरिका से इनका ताल्लुक है, डिप्टी डायरेक्टर है एशिया प्रोग्राम। इसके अलावा दी विल्सन सेंटर के सीनियर एसोसिएट हैं। फॉरेन पॉलिसी पर बड़ा ज़बरदस्त आर्टिकल लिखते हैं। एनालिस्ट हैं, साउथ एशिया स्पेशलिस्ट हैं। नाज़रीन, साउथ एशिया के मामलात पर एक स्पेस थी जिसको कंडक्ट किया, होस्ट किया मुस्तफ़ा भाई ने, और उनके साथ को होस्ट थे डॉक्टर सलमान भाई और मुनीब भाई। नाज़रीन, बड़ी ज़बरदस्त पेज थी। मैं इसलिए इस पर वीडियो करने जा रहा हूँ क्योंकि साउथ एशिया के जितने भी मामलात थे उन पर बड़े ज़बरदस्त और बड़े सख्त सवालात किए गए माइकल कुगेलमैन के साथ, और उन्होंने बड़े ज़बरदस्त जवाबात भी दिए। इसलिए मैं चाहता हूँ नाज़रीन कि आप ये जो पूरी स्पेस थी, सारे सवालों जवाब वो लाजमी सुने, क्योंकि नाज़रीन इसमें अफ़गानिस्तान की सूरत हाल को बड़ा ज़बरदस्त कवर किया गया, उस पर बड़े सख्त सवालात किए गए। मकबूजा कश्मीर से ताल्लुक़ रखने वाली हमारी एक बहन ने बड़े सख्त सवालात किए माइकल कुगेलमैन से, अमेरिका की पॉलिसी के रिलेटेड, जो कश्मीर और पाकिस्तान और इंडिया से रिलेटेड है। इसके अलावा नाज़रीन, पाकिस्तान चीन के ताल्लुकात पर बात की गई, चीन और अमेरिका की जो कोल्ड वार है उसके रिलेटेड बात की गई। ओवरऑल जो मोदी के साथ चंद दिन पहले वाक़या पेश आया उस पर भी बात की गई, और जो इंडिया में जो कुछ चल रहा है, जो मिनॉरिटीज़ के साथ जुल्म हो रहा है, उन सब पर बड़े सख्त सवालात किए गए। नाज़रीन, मैं आपको ये स्पेस सुनवाने जा रहा हूँ और मैं गुजारिश करूँगा काइंडली आप मुकम्मल इसको देखिएगा ताकि आपको पता चल सके कि ये कितनी ज़बरदस्त स्पेस थी। नाज़रीन, आपको पाकिस्तानी मीडिया पर ना तो ऐसे सवालात नज़र आएंगे, ना ऐसे मेहमान नज़र आएंगे, और ना ही नाज़रीन आपको ऐसे जवाबात मिलेंगे, और ना ही आपको ये पता चलेगा कि अमेरिका की जो पॉलिसी है साउथ एशिया से रिलेटेड वो क्या है, क्या उसमें दोगलापन है या वो स्ट्रेट फॉरवर्ड है। नाज़रीन, आइए आपको सुनवाते हैं ये ज़बरदस्त स्पेस।
Hey, good morning, Mike. How are you?
Very well, thanks. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
All right, I think we can officially start. So, good morning and good evening to everybody around the world who is joining us and who is about to join us. Please welcome Mr. Michael Kugelman. He is the South Asia correspondent for Foreign Policy magazine, and we are here to discuss his latest article. And the topic is, what are we going to see in South Asia in the next year? So we are looking towards the future of South Asia, and that's what we are going to discuss. He's with us for just 90 minutes, so try to limit the timing of your questions, and Mike has also promised us to keep his answers short. And the panel here with us will introduce themselves, and then we'll go towards Mike, Mustafa and Salman, and myself and Alpha Bravo Sadia Shees. We are all going to be taking questions from you guys, so feel free to DM us. We already got several questions that we are going to include, and we are going to be taking speakers as well. So the request to speakers is just limit your question to one question at a time and try to keep it short. And with that, I'll pass it over to Salman. Go ahead, Salman.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Muneeb, and thanks, Mike, for committing to this space. Just a short background: I'm based in Germany, Pakistani diaspora, scientist by profession, a pharmaceutical scientist with a keen interest on science and technology and interest for geopolitics. Over to you, Mustafa.
Yeah, thank you so much, Salman. I'm Mustafa Aleem. I'm from Lahore, Pakistan. I'm teaching law and also practicing law as well. And I'm part-time working as well with the ICRC, International Committee of Red Cross. So yeah, that's from my side. I think we should start formally now. I think Sadia left. Sadia, can you please also introduce yourself? Thank you.
Hi, Mike. I'm Sadia Nawaz. Lovely to touch base with you. I reside in Dallas, Texas, and super glad that you're giving us your time. I know that you're limited, and we appreciate your time with us today.
Thank you. Great to be here with you all.
All right. So, Mike, we know the articles that you have recently published or written, authored those articles. Maybe you want to start with a preface on your projections for South Asia in 2022, and then we'll move to the first speaker with his questions.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So, my
last column for foreign policy identified 4 issues to be watching in the coming year in the region. And certainly it wasn't meant to be an exhaustive list. There's so many more beyond the ones that I had mentioned. But very briefly, I could just identify them. The first one is essentially what becomes of the Taliban in Afghanistan and what will be its fate. Will it be able to hold on to power? What challenges will it face? And I think looking at what happened toward the latter part of 2021 with a growing humanitarian crisis, coupled with other challenges that the Taliban faces, terrorism, particularly emanating from Islamic State Khorasan, as well as internal divisions within the Taliban. And looming over all this is the fact that Afghanistan is not getting the international, the financial assistance that it was able to depend on for many years. What does this all mean for the Taliban's ability to stay in power, to get things done? What does it mean for stability in Afghanistan? And all of this could certainly have regional effects, regional implications, such as refugee flows, for example. So that's one of the issues that I identified. A second one was, and this is really, I think, the most important in the immediate term, is the issue of Omicron. We know that, as in pretty much all of the world now, Omicron is very present and spreading rapidly across the region. The region really, for the most part, dodged a bullet in 2020 in the sense that it was not hit as hard by the pandemic as so many countries in the West. 2021, of course, was very different. India was hit with a catastrophic wave, as well as Nepal and Bangladesh as well, some other countries. Pakistan, at least according to the data, the reported cases and all, was hit less hard, which some have noted may be because of its bad relations with India, that the borders aren't really open. So the Delta surge in India was not able to spread to Pakistan, though it did spread to Nepal. Anyway, so this in 2022, what happens with Omicron in the region will be really important for several reasons that go beyond the public health implications. One is that we know one of the big storylines in many countries in South Asia during the last half of 2021 was inflationary tendencies, high levels of inflation. And if there were to be another serious surge of the pandemic in the region, that could conceivably exacerbate the economic struggles. I think it's unlikely that you would see the large-scale lockdowns that you saw in India in 2020, for example, but still there'll be implications drawing from this. And also, there had been a few countries in the region, particularly India, that had started to show signs of economic recovery last year. And obviously, if the pandemic hit some of these countries hard again, then there could be deleterious implications for economic recovery. Third is politics, domestic politics. Much of the region has national elections in 2023 or 2024, but 2022 is key because you're going to have 5 state elections in India, and Pakistan is what I singled out in the article as the country to watch out for its politics, because at this point, at least, Pakistan is the next country scheduled to have national elections in the spring of 2023. So this year will be notable to see how things play out politically, as that could help us get a better sense as to what to expect once we get to the elections in Pakistan in 2023. And I argue in the piece that the PTI government's handling of the economy, I think, will be a key indication of the political headwinds, so to speak, as well as the Prime Minister's relationship with the military, which, based on my read, has been quite good, quite cordial for much of his term as Prime Minister, though there was a spat that arose towards the end of last year over the issue of the succession, or the process of bringing in the next ISI director, the leader of the spy agency. So that'll be something to watch. Finally, China. I think that China's increasing presence in South Asia over the last few years has been one of the big geopolitical stories that we've seen play out. I think we've seen through investments in infrastructure, through more recently pandemic assistance, China has really been scaling up its role across the region. And I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out next year for a variety of reasons. One, looking at Pakistan, CPEC lost some momentum last year. We'll try to work with Pakistan to re-inject more momentum into that project. China was concerned about security risks in Pakistan. Pakistan was increasingly concerned about taking on new projects because of the financial implications. So that'll be something to watch. Nepal has got a new government or a new prime minister last year who is perceived to be less friendly to China than was his predecessor. So could China try to run some type of charm offensive to scale up its relations with the new government there? And of course, India is key in this context too. The ramifications of the 2020 border clash in Ladakh have not been dealt with. We know that there has not been full-scale disengagement by the two militaries. So how China plays things in India should be very, very interesting as well. And finally, Afghanistan. Will China try to become a bigger economic player in Afghanistan than it has in the past? I think a lot of that will depend on the stability situation, but that's something to watch too. So I'll end there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mike, for the details. Just move on to this first speaker, that is Sher Khan. Sher Khan, can you please introduce yourself, and then you can ask your question quickly within 30 seconds or 1 minute, please, Sher Khan.
Okay. Sure, thanks a lot. My name is Sher Khan. I reside in Toronto, Canada, but I'm originally from Karachi, Pakistan. I'm a CPA, Chartered Professional Accountant here, previously called Chartered Accountant. So my two quick questions, I have many, but and there are so many participants. Firstly, you mentioned state elections in India. And unfortunately, now we Pakistani cannot divorce ourselves from Indian politics. Last time they had national elections, there was a so-called Balakot incident as well, and we had to respond. So my concern is that within keeping in mind yesterday's development in Punjab, Indian Punjab, Mr. Modi's fiasco there, and state elections coming up, do you think some new step can be taken by the Indian state or BJP government, which might affect the regional peace? And secondly, this question, we didn't used to even consider this kind of a question, but I'm just concerned the U.S. policy towards Afghanistan and South Asia in general. How much is it bipartisan in nature? Because we have had a situation with Iran nuclear deal in the past, where a certain government made commitments and then it was turned over by the other government. So how much bipartisan the U.S. approach is towards the region? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I'll take your second question first. The U.S. really doesn't have a formal policy in South Asia. It really looks at the region through silos, through its relationship with India, through the situation in Afghanistan, through its relationship with Pakistan, and everything else sort of is given short shrift. But I think if there's one area of U.S. policy in South Asia where there is very strong bipartisan support, and this would be no surprise to most of those listening here, is the relationship with India. I mean, there's bipartisan support for scaling up that relationship, particularly on the security side. U.S. policy in Afghanistan, that became very partisan in the sense that many people, particularly Republicans, but also Democrats, disagreed with President Biden's decision to withdraw, and especially after what happened toward the end of the withdrawal, it became a very partisan issue. Even though I would argue that if you were to look at public opinion in America in recent years, there's pretty strong support for a withdrawal of U.S. forces. But yeah, I think you have to look at the U.S.-India relationship. That's where the strong bipartisan support lies when it comes to any type of U.S. policy in South Asia. In terms of the question about India and its elections, yes, I think unfortunately it appears that the government, the Indian government, has concluded that hate speech and nasty communal rhetoric can be something that helps in elections, and certainly anti-Pakistan messaging does as well. And so, yeah, I think that with, 5 elections coming up in India this year, 5 state elections coming up, I fear what that could imply for what we hear, what plays out politically. And yeah, I think we all know just over the last few weeks some particularly terrible things that happened, including for me, which continues to be so terrible, though altogether unsurprising, is this conference that took place over a period of several days, where speakers called for genocide, essentially, against Muslims and religious minorities on the whole, and the fact that there was zero response at all, no reaction at all from Indian political figures, from the ruling party. Very telling, very unfortunate. And unfortunately, I fear that there could be more of that, just because that rhetoric seems to sell, particularly when you have political moments and campaigns and elections coming up. So that's very troubling. In terms of what this could mean for relations with Pakistan, that I don't know. I hope that we don't have a repeat of what happened in 2019 with Balakot, but yeah, it's obviously a relationship that's in a very fragile state, and I think that any goodwill that may have emerged from that ceasefire that was concluded about a year ago, I think, back in February of 2021, I think that's there's not all that much left of it, because there hasn't been much forward movement in the relationship beyond that key development last year.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yes. Now we can move to Salman. Salman, you have a question, and if you can ask that, please.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Mustafa. So, Mike, thanks for a detailed response, but just a different perspective. We are seeing a method to this madness, and if you're looking at India's current GDP, even after contracting by -8%, is still at $2.6 trillion, which on a first impression looks quite impressive, right? But the thing is, we need to ask ourselves how much of that money is accessible to the Indian government. And surprisingly, the government's revenues are hardly $240 billion. And their expenditures currently stand at $600 billion. That means year on year, for the next 5 years, they will be accumulating additional $350 billion of debt a year. So the current debt, internal debt, stand at $2.7 trillion, and which will be by $4.4 trillion according to Statista.com. You add the external debt of additional $600 billion, that's a $5 trillion of total debt. And surprise, surprise, this was something that Narendra Modi has promised before he was running for his first term, a $5 trillion economy. And we believe economy is the reason that the communal hatred against Pakistan suits BJP and RSS radicalized government in the center. So your thoughts on that, please.
So I'm not an economist, so I really shouldn't weigh in too much on this. But yes, I mean, there's something to be said for this idea that economic stress is something that could prompt the government to push the social agenda more in order to distract attention from economic strain, targeting the rank and file, so to speak. I think that's an important fact to put out there. I can't point to any type of causation, but yeah, I think it's important to keep a sort of a broader perspective here, that the Prime Minister remains quite popular in India, and even despite his handling of the COVID crisis last year, which we can all agree was terrible, it may have had some type of immediate term impact on his popularity, and I think some polls did show that. And he has, I'm sure, lost some popularity from several years ago, but he still remains very popular, and particularly because the opposition, I think, has not been in a position to capitalize on these vulnerabilities that you could argue crept in starting in the spring of last year, when his government's handling of the pandemic was on full display. So it's got a lot of tricks up its sleeve, so to speak. So I don't know. I can't speak specifically to your question. I can't address it directly. But I think the important thing to remember here is that, this is a party, BJP, that remains quite popular, even if it loses a few of these state elections this year. I think it's going to be in a pretty good position. Obviously, it's way too early to be making predictions about the next national elections, which isn't happening until 2024. But this is a party that and a government that remains quite popular, even if not at the levels that it was at several years ago.
Thanks, Mike. So we have been joined by Karen. So Karen, if you have a question for Mike or the panelists here, the floor is all yours.
Yeah, hi everybody. For those who don't know me, I'm in Washington, D.C., and I've known Michael for many years, and we have lots of WhatsApp discussions almost daily, so, we are friends and colleagues. I would like for people in Pakistan to use this floor and this space, since it's really you who should ask questions of Michael, and especially about what's happening here in Washington. I think that should also come up vis-a-vis Pakistan and the region. But I don't really have any questions of Michael that I haven't asked him myself yet. So thanks for having this space, and good luck, Michael. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Karen. I appreciate the words of support.
Thank you so much, Karen. Now we move to Sadia. Sadia, you have a question we can ask? Yeah,
yes. Hi, Mike. I've been following.
And for the audience, we are going to take more questions from the audience. So, anybody who wants to ask a question, please request for the mic. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yes, just a quick question regarding Afghanistan. I know you've touched it briefly. I'm just concerned as to why the U.S. is withholding the humanitarian funds for Afghanistan. Could there be perhaps a political outcome, a different outcome that the U.S. is expecting in that region?
Yeah, thanks. So it hasn't been withholding humanitarian funds on the whole. I mean, it has announced some new support over the last few months. But indeed, I think the issue is... Right. The issue, which I guess you were alluding to, is the sanctions that have been put in place by the Biden administration, and especially the $9 or $10 billion in Afghan foreign reserves that have been frozen by the U.S. I think maybe that's what you were referring to.
Yes, that's what I'm referring to.
Yeah.
Yes, the frozen assets.
Right. Well, I mean, it's because of, from the Biden administration's perspective, it's because of the Taliban. It has nothing to do with the withdrawal. It's because of the Taliban and the way in which it seized power, which was, of course, not through. At the end of the day, it was not through violence. It stepped into Kabul without having to fire a bullet. But, it is viewed as a military takeover. The Taliban did not come into power through negotiations, through election, or anything like that. And also, it's because of what the Taliban represents. And I think it's important to put out here that the U.S. and the West are happy to engage and engage on official levels with brutal, nasty regimes. And, some of America's top partners, including top strategic partners, over the years have had terrible human rights records. But I think that the perception here about the Taliban is that it goes further than that, particularly because of its ties, its longstanding and continuing ties to Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations, as well as its social policies that are viewed as even more retrograde and repressive than what you see in the likes of Saudi Arabia. I mean, the issue of women's education, for example. So I think that's why. And also, I do think that there are domestic political risks as perceived by the Biden administration if it were to unfreeze some of those monies, if it were to be willing to provide finances directly to the Taliban as opposed to channeling them through outside agencies. just because of what I said about the Taliban before, because of how it's perceived. And this is a huge issue. That there have been so many discussions about this that you're really looking at a moral quandary, a moral conundrum, that you have a humanitarian crisis that is worsening by the day, and it's the Afghan people that are the most penalized by these decisions that the U.S. makes vis-a-vis the Taliban and not wanting to provide more assistance. So that's the best way I could answer that question.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. Now we move on to our next speaker, that is Nadeem. Yes, Nadeem, you have any question for Mike, please?
Assalamu alaikum, Mustafa. Michael, and all, actually. So, Michael, you actually mentioned something about the situation in India for minorities, right? And it's not good news for a lot of minorities in India. And I think what we see and we know, there are standing resolution against India on Kashmir, and with the really heavy army presence in Kashmir, it makes it really volatile region in the area. So when you look back and you see East Timor and South Sudan, why does the world move so swiftly when it comes to something like something in East Timor and South Sudan, where the opponents are probably the Muslims, right? And the other population is saved from.
Let's focus on South Asia.
I know. So that's what I'm trying to figure out, right? So Manip, why world is not making noise about what is happening in India?
So thanks. I had these discussions many times before. I don't necessarily think it's an issue seen through the lens of who the victims are, the fact that they're Muslims in this context, but more in a function of what country this is playing out in, right? This is India. This is a country that so much of the world, including Muslim majority states, are very keen to engage with and see investment opportunities, and in the case of the U.S. and other countries in the West, opportunities for strategic partnerships that can take on the rise of China. This is simply a reality, and I think it's important to highlight here that the OIC. You all know this. The OIC has always been reluctant to take a stronger position, a more critical position toward India about the issue of Kashmir. And of course, this caused a spat between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia some time ago. That's what it comes down to. It's a very basic but important reality that moral considerations do not govern international relations. I think that the realist theory of international relations is very hard to push back against in terms of trying to explain why this is. That's just the reality of how these things are. And I think that unless something were to change very dramatically in Kashmir, or more broadly in the India context, I don't really see those calculations changing. But I should say, final point, there's been a lot of focus on what's been happening in India in terms of the threats to minorities and what's happening in Kashmir. I think that the Article 370 revocation was really a turning point, just in the sense that media coverage international media coverage really intensified on what was going on there after that happened. But one could argue that rash of increased media coverage ran out of steam some months after August 2019. But I think it's important to distinguish between what governments are thinking and how they look at this versus media, rights activists, scholars as well. So I think there's an important distinction to be made between those two categories of groups.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. Yeah, can we move, because the speakers who have asked the question, Nadima, can I move you down so I can put on some other speakers as well? And now I ask Haris for the question. Haris, you can ask your question, please. First of all, if you can introduce yourself, please. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mustafa. Hello, everyone. My name is Haris. I'm a student of
Bachelor's International Relations, and I'm based in Abbottabad, Pakistan. My question to Kugelman is that if you subscribe to the view that China's arrival as a great power is likely to echo the challenges to the existing world order, led by the pro-status quo dominant powers like the US, and we see that we are now entering into a Cold War scenario, and containing China as containing China has become Washington's foremost national security priority. How do you see the future of United States and Pakistan's relations as now Pakistan's paradigm has totally shifted towards China?
Yeah, so I always push back against the idea that there's a new emerging Cold War and that the U.S. is trying to contain China. I think that a better word to use is counter. The U.S. its broader goal when it comes to China is to draw in a critical mass of other countries in a position to work with the U.S. to provide alternatives to what China has been able to do. Alternatives, particularly in terms of investments, trying to push back against the Belt and Road Initiative, and trying to provide more support to those countries that feel threatened by countries and key players that feel threatened by China's activities. And certainly this ranges from U.S. allies like Japan, South Korea, key friends like Taiwan. So it would be wrong to suggest that the U.S. and China are on a collision course and that the U.S. is trying to provoke China. And I think for me, one of the best ways to highlight how it would be wrong to discuss this U.S.-China rivalry as part of a new Cold War is look at how things are playing out. You don't have two neatly divided camps emerging in which you have pro-U.S. camp, pro-China camp. You don't really have that. I mean, you do to some extent, but I would argue that you have many countries, particularly in Asia, that want to have a good relationship with both the U.S. and China, particularly countries in Southeast Asia and South Asia that certainly welcome and encourage Chinese economic support, but look to the U.S. For other types of support, including military support when it comes to U.S. allies like the Philippines, for example, treaty allies like the Philippines. So I think what we're seeing now with the Biden administration is that, yes, I mean, it definitely views China as a competitor, as a rival, whatever term you want to use. But I think the goal for the U.S. is not to contain China, but to try to put together initiatives, and the Indo-Pacific policy is a big part of this, come up with mechanisms, infrastructure programs, backing agencies like the Development Finance Corporation that are meant to push back against China's rising influence. Now, there's some that argue that when you have two major powers, when you have a top power and it has a main competitor that's competing with it, that war is inevitable. Sort of like the Thucydides trap idea that Graham Allison has come out with. I'm not sure if I buy into that, but I just would issue what, at least for me, is a warning that we not use the rhetoric of the past when it comes to the U.S.-China relationship. There's been a lot of heated rhetoric that's been put out there, but I think that Cold War is not the right term to use. I think that competition is a better word to use. I think that's more reflective of what's really going on.
Right. Thank you so much. Yes, Shahryar, you're next. Please introduce yourself and ask your question. Thank you. Shahryar, are you listening? Okay, we can move to. I think Shahryar is not here. We can move to Amir. Amir, assalamu alaikum, and please introduce yourself and ask your question for Michael. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Hello, Michael, again. We've spoken before. Nice to speak to you again. There's a few things you mentioned. I've actually got a few notes here, so I'll try to be brief and then ask my question. In respect of Afghanistan's ties with Al-Qaeda, I mean, there's this forced association between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda because of a historical a reality of Al-Qaeda being there. But to continue to assert that there is still that connection, or in the event or in the reality that the CIA were essentially creating Al-Qaeda and using them as a proxy locally for whatever objectives. I think it's unfair to say that the Afghanistan Taliban, as it stands now, still has those ties with Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations. This is it's a case of you repeat a lie often enough and people begin to believe it. So I think we need to stop asserting the notion of terrorism with the Taliban, because I think it just serves to denigrate as opposed to resolve the issue there. The other point is about America and the hypocrisy is what I'm referring to here. There's a humanitarian crisis you mentioned in Afghanistan. There's a humanitarian crisis in Yemen, driven by one of the US key allies, which is the Saudi, and they have terrible human rights records as well. No one ever mentions. It never gets the light of day as far as American politics is concerned in terms of what's going on there. So these are examples. I mean, the USA's support of Israel. I know we're not talking about Israel today, but it's silent in the face of what the Modi regime is doing. There was a conference a week or two ago where they were openly calling for the genocide of Muslims. I know you've answered the India question many times, so I don't want to push it. But what I'm highlighting here is this kind of blatant, naked hypocrisy of the US when it comes to its policy making. When it's supporting certain countries and not supporting others, holding back money from certain countries, not others. You're framing the China issue as you're calling it a pushback on its rising influence. Well, it's just a Cold War in other terms. I mean, all wars and things are about trade, ultimately. So if it's a trade war going on with China, let's call it what it is. The geopolitics of the region clearly demonstrate to us that it's ultimately got to do with trade. So my question, and I'll come to it now, is, there's this barefaced hypocrisy, not just from America, but many of the European states as well, that we see day in, day out. It's either they think we're completely stupid and we can't see what they're doing, or they're so deluded that they think they can get away with these hypocritical statements and positions on international affairs, and no one's ever going to step up to them. So I guess the question I'm asking, do you agree with me in that there is a gross hypocrisy by the US in terms of its policy with various countries, and ultimately money trumps morals when it comes to what they need to do, and there's no real efforts to do the right thing. It's more a case of what's better for us strategically when it comes to trade. So again, trade is trumping everything here, and that, to the average people like us on the street, just thinks of hypocrisy. I know it's more of a statement than a question, but I do ask whether you agree that there is hypocrisy in what the US administration does around the world. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Well, yes, yeah, of course, I definitely agree with you. I think it's clear as day that the U.S. will always hold certain countries to higher standards than others when it comes to issues like human rights and democracy, for sure. That's very clear. And I think it's particularly worth calling out with the current administration, which has made democracy, promotion, human rights a key pillar of its foreign policy, or at least it's claimed that those things are going to be key pillars of U.S. foreign policy. And so, yeah, I think you look at the recent democracy summit as one clear example, right? The fact that you had a number of non-democracies that were invited to that summit, you had a number of democracies that were not invited to it, and so on and so forth. It's not a good look, for sure. But this is, as I said before, moral considerations do not drive international relations. Whether with U.S. policy or policy of pretty much any other country. And I think with the U.S., you'd have to go back quite some time, maybe to the Jimmy Carter administration, when you did have a government and a president that really viewed moral considerations. And this is another reason why, we ask the question so much, is why do you have so many terrible humanitarian crises playing out across the world, in Afghanistan, but other places, the places that you mentioned, Yemen and elsewhere, that don't get sufficient attention or bandwidth from governments? Well, the policies don't revolve around responding to humanitarian crises. I wish I were wrong on that, but that's how it is. So yeah, I agree with you. I'm not sure I agree with you with the earlier points you made, particularly about the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. I think the question there, is what evidence is there that they are not still allies? I think that's the bigger question to ask. There's no indication.
But the burden of proof is on the accuser, though, Michael. The burden of the proof is on the accuser. So we're accusing them of being associated with Al-Qaeda, but we've got to prove it. We have to prove it. Otherwise, it just becomes an assertion. And when official people in government, in reporters, assert these things often enough, people start believing them. That's the problem.
Right. Well, I mean, you could look at what's happened over the last few months. When the Taliban was making all of those was freeing all those prisoners some time ago. It freed prisoners from a variety of different groups, including Al-Qaeda. And there's no indication that it tried to do anything about those folks that were free.
I think that was a general.
I take your point.
Yeah.
And they weren't distinguishing, but still, there is no reason. I think the question is. I guess I take your point, but given the history of ties between these two groups, and given the fact that there has been not even any statement from the Taliban, other than the usual lip service about how we're not going to support terrorism on our soil, no indication that it has broken with the group. Though what I will say here is that Al-Qaeda certainly is not the threat that it used to be. I mean, it's a shadow of its former self. So I think that Al-Qaeda is perhaps not the group that we should be most concerned about. Well, what about the Pakistani Taliban? The Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP, which has long-standing links to the Taliban in Afghanistan. There are, of course, different organizations, but what indication is there that the Taliban has sought to expel that group or deny space to it? It hasn't. It's facilitated talks between the Pakistani state and the TTP, but it hasn't done anything else, and I don't think it's willing to. And I think that would be the case with so many of these terror groups in Afghanistan, of course, other than ISK, which is a rival. For me, though, I'm still looking for more proof that things have changed. It's not necessarily a case of not hearing indications that it is still aligned or connected to Al-Qaeda, but more so the fact that there's silence on the issue of what are we seeing to suggest that it's no longer aligned with it. So I'll end there. But thank you for the good points.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for the detailed answer. One very quick point, and I'll get off the mic then. For Afghanistan to expect for America to release payments or funds after the Taliban squarely defeated them, there's a poem in Urdu. It's Mera Munsif Mera Qatil hai, kya mere haq mein faisla dega. My judge is my killer. What justice can I expect from this person? Who's a judge and also my killer? It's the same thing here, and I don't think America's going to do anything good in terms of releasing those funds and helping that country stand up again. But that's just my opinion. Thank you again. Musa, you can take my mic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Ali Mirza. Now we move to Muneeb, the co-host. I guess you have a question, Muneeb, you can ask now. Thank you.
Yeah, one of the aspects of Michael's article was the 3 farm laws repealed in India by after the long the farmers' protest. I would like to hear Michael, what he thinks about that, and is that a big hit for this current BJP regime in India going towards the next election? Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, thanks. And to clarify, you're referring to something that I had written in another article in which I essentially highlighted what I saw as some of the most surprising and biggest developments in South Asia in 2021. And indeed, one of them was Modi's decision to repeal those 3 farm laws that had sparked protests by farmers for a number of months. Yeah, I mean, it seems like it was purely politics that prompted him to make that decision, given that you have an election coming in Punjab, and Punjab is where you had a large number of those protests. You'd also had a number of Sikhs who had been involved in those protests, and he made the announcement of the repeal on the Independence Day, or the birth date of the founder of Sikhism. So clearly politics were involved, but what I found so striking is that he actually was willing to let those political considerations guide his thinking. And from my read of Prime Minister Modi over his years in power is that he has not necessarily been felt encumbered by political risks, that he's been willing to make these pretty significant moves. I mean, the demonetization move perhaps is the biggest example, and it was clear that people were going to be unhappy with that, but that didn't stop him from doing it. So that's what I think makes his decision to repeal the farm laws so significant. And yeah, you could certainly argue it's a victory for all of these farmers that have been protesting. Absolutely. It, I think, demonstrates a pretty significant political defeat for Modi. But, then there are those that argue that for India's economy to truly reach a point where it's self-sustaining, strong, and so on, that it needs to undertake politically difficult but nonetheless necessary agricultural reforms. And obviously, if you repeal these farm laws, then you're going against that idea. Now, his government claims that they're going to try to bring them back. That seems a bit hard to believe. I would think that they maybe would try to do that in states where the BJP is in control. But there are plenty of states where the BJP is not in control. But yeah, so it was a major development. I was personally surprised that it happened. I know many were as well. But again, I think that's an exception more than the rule when it comes to Prime Minister Modi in terms of how he decided to play that.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael. Now we move to Cade. Cade, sorry for that you're waiting for such a long time. Now you can ask your question. Please introduce yourself first. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Cade Levinson. I work with the Schiller Institute. Pakistani listeners might know some of our representatives, Helga Zalparouche and Hussein Askari, have been on PTV pretty regularly the last few months. But I'd kind of a question stemming from what's been discussed on Afghanistan and China, and kind of bring it in generally then to what was mentioned about the pandemic and the South Asian economy. So with your framing of it as more of a competition between U.S. and China, I'm wondering, what do you see the U.S. actually bringing to the table for competition? Because we've seen in the last 20 years of occupation, how much were they actually able to develop the nation of Afghanistan compared to when the Taliban first took office? They immediately reached out to China, and there are mutual talks to start developing them along the terms of the Belt and Road Initiative. And especially then, given the larger concerns of the economy in this time of pandemic and the initiative from China of adding a health Silk Road to the Belt and Road Initiative, what does the U.S. have to offer right now apart from just the idea of competition? Because from what I've seen, China's even offered to bring the U.S. involved with the Belt and Road and with this process of win-win development generally. And that's kind of what I'm wondering is, in your opinion, does the U.S. have an option that is in moral line that doesn't include, sanctions similar to the Caesar sanctions in Syria right now, but in Afghanistan that have millions of people on the brink of starvation? What do they have to offer apart from their already instituted power and the force that they can bring from that?
Yeah, thanks. Some important points there. In fact, you said something that I should have brought up earlier. Indeed, I think that the U.S., at least at this point, is not really able to hold a candle up to what China has been able to do, particularly in terms of the investment blitz that it's been engaging in across the world, particularly with infrastructure. BRI is huge, and we could talk about how it's lost some momentum over the last year, which is true. But the U.S. can't hold a candle to that. If you look at this from a geographic context, the U.S. simply is not present in South Asia as much as China is. It has its strong relationship with India, it has its relationship with Pakistan, but it doesn't really have a strong presence beyond that. Central Asia, which I think is one of these regions that's going to become increasingly important, strategically in the coming years, that's really been a battleground for influence between Russia and China. And the U.S. is not really present there at all, though. There were some indications that it's been trying to change that, particularly through this sort of very forgotten new quad with the U.S., Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan that was concluded some time ago. But so the U.S. is not present as China is, first of all. And indeed, I think that it would take a lot for the U.S. to be able to build some type of rival project to BRI. And that's the plan. The Biden administration wants to use some of the tools.
Sorry, that was me by mistake, Mike. Please proceed.
Sorry, I was saying that when it comes to trying to provide a counterpart to BRI, indeed, the U.S. is not in a position to do that. It wants to use the tools associated with the Indo-Pacific policy, such as the DFC and the Blue Dot Network, to sponsor all these new infrastructure projects in the region, which is great. But so far, there's really not much there. And, when Alice Wells several years ago made that big pitch for, this idea that the U.S. can do investment in Pakistan better than China can, maybe it may sound great to many, but there wasn't any follow-on to that. How would that be done? And other than this stock emphasis on more transparent, equitable investment. Well, of course, that all sounds good, but beyond the catchphrases, is there any substance to that? No, not yet. And finally, on the moral point, yes, certainly I agree that given what happened in Afghanistan, the U.S. certainly deserves a lot of blame for that. But I do think that we should not soft pedal China's own activities, which in my view have been in many cases very nefarious, very repressive, very dangerous, particularly in terms of its surveillance tactics, how it uses technology in very dangerous ways, and also the provocations that it's carried out in the South China Sea and along the border with India, quite frankly, as well. So I think it's important not to give too much credits to China here. And at the end of the day, China is a totalitarian, or it's a dictatorial, it's an authoritarian state. And that's something that we really cannot forget. The U.S., certainly its democracy is struggling, but it remains democracy, and it's trying to work with like-minded countries to push back against China from a values perspective, too. And again, I know it's very easy to criticize that because the U.S. and its partners are so hypocritical in how they look at the world through this idea of democracy and other values. But just wanted to provide a fuller picture. But thank you for your very good point.
Just real quick, I'm wondering if would not cooperation as opposed to competition provide an avenue for both the U.S. and China to be able to temper the excesses of each other, like what our institute proposes in Operation Ibn Sina, to have these positive projects through development be a tempering force, as opposed to where we do make projects with dictatorial regimes like Saudi Arabia, like what's happening in Yemen on destructive projects. Why not put that towards positive projects as well?
Yeah, and I think that's an important point about cooperation. That the U.S. actually has, or the Biden administration has sought cooperation with China where it can. I mean, you look at the issue of climate change, which is, an area that's very important for the Biden administration, and it has clearly expressed a willingness to try to engage with China on that issue. It hasn't worked out very well so far. But, you look at some of the messaging that Biden had come out with even before he became president, when he had talked about how we want to cooperate with China where our interests dictate that we should, in the areas of climate change, in the areas of public health, even in the areas of non-proliferation, interestingly enough. And to me, that sort of pushes back against this idea of a Cold War with China. The fact that the administration has held out this need to cooperate with China in certain spaces. So yeah, I agree with you. Cooperation would be great, but clearly, the strategic and the security issues at play make it very difficult to give more prominence to those potential areas of cooperation. And I think many of you may have read a report soon after Biden was elected, in which it became known that John Kerry, who is the climate change czar in the Biden administration, he had tried to push his boss and others in the White House to suspend competition with China in order to focus more fully on the climate change issue. And he clearly didn't win that argument. And that's a very interesting thing that he even tried to push that. But soon after that report came out, Kurt Campbell, who is the lead, the Indo-Pacific coordinator in the White House, he essentially said that competition is here to stay with China, which I think was a clear indication of where this administration is going in its relationship with China.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kay, for your question and your answer, Michael. Now we move on to Nishu. Nishu, please introduce yourself and ask your question briefly. Thank you so much. Nishu, are you able to listen to me or not? Okay, I think, we move on to official. Officially, you can ask your question and introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the mic. And hi, Michael. Official here. I'm a civil engineer by training, doing kosher certification for food exporters of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Saudi Arabia. My question is, Michael, that if Pakistan allow its citizens to travel to Israel on Pakistani passport, so this act, how the Trinity will look at it, USA, American, Biden administration, China, and India, how they will look at if Pakistan allow its citizen to travel to Israel on Pakistani passport this year. And secondly, it's a part of the question, how India will feel and would maneuver to keep a softening stance of Pakistan toward Israel, just only on this one instance, how India will maneuver to keep Israel away from the Kashmir issue and to not let Pakistan go into the Palestine issue with Israel. I hope I was clear. Thank you.
Well, thanks. That's a very interesting question, and something that I certainly wouldn't have thought of in terms of things to be thinking about in 2022. Well, look, I think that the political realities are such that it seems very unlikely that scenario that you lay out would actually come to pass. I know that there had been some discussion when the Abraham Accords were signed in the Trump era, when you started to have Israel making peace with several Muslim majority countries, whether that could lead to Pakistan softening its position toward Israel. And I think it's quite clear that there's not going to be any movement on that issue, including on sort of more unofficial person-to-person relations, such as what you lay out. And so I don't know.
There's definitely a chance if Maulana Fazlur Rahman is in power, which is not likely in the case. So let's move on.
Well, and I will say, and I'm sure many folks know this, that there have been a number of very senior Pakistani political leaders, not a huge number, but a fair number of Pakistani political leaders over the years that have been open to this idea of better relations with Israel, even if there's not going to be recognition. So sort of like the Taliban model, right? Trying to engage more with a certain entity without providing formal recognition to it. I mean, you go back, Musharraf had indicated an interest in this at one point. Nawaz Sharif, Benazir Bhutto. It's very, very interesting. But I think that at this point, that's not something that's it's not a very realistic prospect to put it mildly. And in terms of Israel, certainly I think that it would be perfectly receptive to having that in place, just for economic reasons. I mean, having possibilities to get investors from Pakistan, for example. But that would require, I think, suspending one's disbelief, just because I don't think that's going to happen. India, of course, has a very strong relationship with Israel now that's grown significantly in recent years, to the point that its efforts to balance its relationships with the Palestinians and the Israelis, that's I think has become imbalanced, that it's so close to Israel now. But I think that even India would recognize that it's so unlikely that Pakistan is about to try to develop a relationship with Israel that it's not something that I imagine is anywhere near the top of the radar of Indian officials.
Right. Thank you. Now can we move to Abid? Yeah, Abid Amiri. Yes, please.
Sure.
Introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you, Mustafa. My name is Abid Amir. Michael, it's good to have you in this space. We see what's happening in Kazakhstan. It's not that far from South Asia. It's sort of Central Asia, but it's in that neighborhood. So what I start thinking about is the U.S. leaving Afghanistan the way it did, right? So the U.S.'s retrieval from Afghanistan, is it priming the region, and particularly Afghanistan, for a hot spot of sort of regional powers to get into each one another's throats once again? For instance, China, Russia, India, and everyone else, as they did after 1979. So do you see that happening once again? Is it priming the region, Afghanistan in particular, to be sort of like a hub for proxy wars once again? Thank you.
Yeah. So thanks for that. I'm not an expert on Kazakhstan, so I really shouldn't get into that and what it could mean. But to the second part of your question, yeah, I think that we do have to worry about not just proxy tensions or proxy dynamics, but actual proxy conflict in Afghanistan. But I think that we really only have to start to worry about that if the Taliban were to lose control. And if you were to see it lose control of certain parts of the country, if you start to have a stronger resistance that emerges, and at this point there's no opposition to the Taliban other than ISK, but this Panjshiri resistance, to my mind at this point, doesn't really have much to offer. But if the Taliban struggles, if it starts to if it doesn't gain legitimacy, if you have the emergence of new armed groups that are able to remove the Taliban from power in some areas, that's when you have to start, I think, worrying that you could have external players that basically choose sides and provide backing to some of these new armed movements. I mean, as you, I think, alluded to, this is what happened in the past. I would say that it's different now than things were in the 90s, leading up to 2001. And I think that you do have countries in the region that are willing to tolerate a Taliban in power in ways that had not been the case before. Pardon me. So, Iran, for example, which had backed the Northern Alliance in the past, is not, certainly is concerned about the Taliban control to some extent, but is willing to try to work with it in ways that had not been the case previously. But if things get really bad, if things get out of control, if you have civil war that resumes in Afghanistan, that's when the outside players would conclude that they need to jump in and try to safeguard their interests by providing backing, including arms, potentially, to different factions opposing the Taliban. So that's where I think that it's under those circumstances where we would have to believe that the return of proxy war could be coming back. But I don't think we're at that point now, so long as the Taliban continues to exert full control in the country, which it has, at least at this point.
Can I just pose a follow-up question?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sorry.
You have to be quick. It's like last 20 minutes.
In terms of the U.S., do you think it's intentional to leave the area, the region, as messy as it did to make it a trouble spot for China and others involved? Do you think that was intentional, or it was just the U.S. sick and tired of being in Afghanistan?
No, not at all. There was not that geopolitical factor. The U.S. decided that it wanted to leave, and it decided to leave, and it did not anticipate that the Taliban would take over so quickly, and that set in motion a very chaotic policy process, and that's why we saw what we did over the last few weeks of August. But no. Quite frankly, we talked about U.S.-China rivalry before. The U.S.-China rivalry is not particularly strong in Afghanistan. The U.S. and China actually agree on a lot. They both want there to be more stability, less terrorism. And, China had been hadn't been much of an actor in China over the last 20 years, which many people don't recognize. And yes, in due course, if it concludes that there's enough stability to warrant more of a presence, it could step in. But it's not those considerations that prompted the U.S. U.S. to leave Afghanistan thinking, oh, well, it's going to be the region's mess. Let them clean it up. No, that really, in my view, was not one of the various reasons why it decided to withdraw in the way that it did.
Right. Thank you so much, Michael. Now we move to Nishu. Nishu, can you please introduce yourself and answer a question quickly? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. This is Nishu from Indian Administered Kashmir. My question to you is, since you know what happened on 5th of August 2019, and since from there, Kashmiris are already in a very threat, and every day young boys are being killed, and numerous are put under jails. There are custodial killings in fake encounters, rapes, everything is going on. So Trump administration has disappointed us a lot, and we are very much keenly seeing upon superpower, especially America. So what is Biden administration what is their policy regarding solving the Kashmir issue? Because you knew it very well that Kashmir can become a flashpoint of war between nuclear powers, which we witnessed on February 2019. So it was near both the countries were near the escalation. Only then, when America indulged in it, then there was de-escalation. So could you please explain me? Because on one side, India is giving domicile to non-local Kashmiris who are mainly Hindus of India. Giving them to settle down here, which is against the Geneva Convention, because in a disputed territory you cannot make any law regarding which is a disputed status. And we are here from last 74 years. We have been waiting for UN to act for its resolution. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. Whenever I'm asked this question about, the U.S. position or policy on Kashmir, it's been remarkably consistent for many, many years, and that has been to, essentially stay out of it. And some have argued that this may have changed in the Trump administration, when President Trump appeared to, over several occasions, offer to mediate the dispute. And that was not accurate in the sense that he had said that, he would be happy to mediate if both sides asked him to. And, of course, India's position is it will not have any type of external involvement in the issue. So it was really a hypothetical that was going to lead to a dead end. So I think that it was actually very clever when President Trump made that comment, because I think he was able to indicate to Pakistan some interest, some concern about the dispute, but at the same time, he was essentially coding to India that, well, look, that this is not a serious offer because I know that you're not going to want us to. I think that to the extent that the U.S. looks at the Kashmir issue, it's certainly through a rights lens more so than through a territorial issue. Even after the Article 370 revocation, you did have some relatively light, but nonetheless some criticism from Trump administration officials about the crackdowns that ensued, the internet shutdowns, the arbitrary arrests, all of that. And so that there was that, but there was nothing more than that, which is not a surprise. And with the Biden administration, we could talk about how, despite its emphasis on democracy promotion, it's not going to go out of its way to call out India for these all of these things that are happening in Kashmir. But there are certain types of abuses and human rights violations that are of particular concern to the administration, and particularly Biden, and one of them being the issue of technology, the use of technology in undemocratic ways. And the administration has hit China very hard on this issue. But the internet bans that have played out in Kashmir and elsewhere in Kashmir and in India, should I say, over the last year or so. those are the types of things that would concern the administration. And I believe that you actually did have several Biden administration officials bringing attention to the internet bans and expressing support for India's decision to remove that record level internet ban in Kashmir. And that's sort of a backhanded way of criticizing India to some extent. But so, yeah, short answer to your question is probably not the one you want to hear, but it's the realistic answer is that this is not going to be an issue that the Biden administration would like to discuss. Perhaps when you have senior high-level engagements, then it's the type of issue that would be brought up privately. And I think when Secretary of State Blinken was in India some months ago, I believe that it did come up in some of the discussions he had, particularly with civil society groups in India. But I'm going to look at it as a rights issue and nothing more. And again, I should say that the U.S. position is not unusual, right? I mean, we know that so much of the world would prefer not to delve into this. And, you know, for the reasons that I mentioned before, and this includes countries in the Islamic world, including the OIC, which is, of course, the biggest grouping of Muslim majority countries. So that's how I'll end that.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Yeah, now we can move
Mustafa, an announcement for everybody in the audience that we, after 20 minutes, Mike will go on, but we'll still continue the space. So please keep joining with us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Manif, for the information. Now we can move to, I think, Xavier or Javier. Yeah, you can ask your question. Is Javier Deras? You there? You can introduce yourself and ask your question, please.
Hi, hello. I am new to Twitter Live, but I'm from Los Angeles, California, and I'm barely getting into politics. I'm actually an immigrant from Mexico, residing in the USA, and I am a DACA recipient. DACA is a program that President Barack Obama gave in 2012. And even to this day, I gotta say, I stopped renewing my DACA because, honestly, I thought it was a scam, And now I'm still in Los Angeles, but yes.
Hey, man, we are talking about South Asia geopolitics right now here. So if you have anything related to that, then please go on. Otherwise, we'll have more, people who want to talk about that. Thank you.
Okay, my friend. But I'll keep joining you guys for your talks. It's really interesting. I like it. You guys are hard workers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hard workers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Right. So we can move to, I think, Shahryar. He was lately, I think, disconnected. Yes, Shahryar, you can go on.
Thank you. Hi, Michael. Thank you for your time and answering the questions. My name is Shahryar Shah. I lead one of the technology service lines at a Big Four Management Consulting. Spend my time between San Francisco and London. My question to you, Michael, is about our U.S.-Pakistan relationship. Prime Minister Imran Khan worked really hard.
Hey, Shahryar, you're cutting out a little bit for me. Could you fix your connection maybe or microphone?
Yeah. Am I audible now, Mani?
Yeah, it's much better. Go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you. Michael, so back to the question. My question is about U.S.-Pakistan relationship. It seemed Prime Minister Imran Khan was working well with President Trump after the Trump administration. But since the Biden administration took over, do you think it was the right thing for the Biden administration to say to Pakistan that we don't see ourselves building a broad relationship with Pakistan and have no interest in returning to the days of hyphenated India-Pakistan? So the question is really, was it the right thing to say or the approach? I apologize. Thank you, Michael. And thanks again for your time.
Yeah, thank you. I think that really since 2011, 2012, when you had, which was probably it was a time when you had some really serious crises in the relationship, it's remained fragile ever since then. And I would argue that in the Trump years, it did seem like things were better for a few years. Imran Khan made that visit to Washington that appeared to be very successful on many levels. But I think that it was really all because of the U.S. decision to pursue talks with the Taliban. And I think that the administration, for lack of a better term, it held its nose and said, well, okay, let's do this because we have to, not because we really want to. We want to try to build out a better relationship with Pakistan, which I think is unfortunate. But I think it was a very tactical, very calculated move to try to make things work with Pakistan just so that they could. The U.S. could get Pakistan's assistance with getting the Taliban to the table, because the relationship, it didn't really get much better beyond that. And indeed, you didn't see a broadening of the relationship in ways that you may have liked, certainly not on the levels that you saw, in that brief period in 2009 or so when you had that strategic dialogue in place. And so I think with the Biden administration, the challenge here is that many of the people high up in this government, including Biden himself, had been in government at that really bad time in U.S.-Pakistan relations in 2011, 2012. Many of them were in the Obama administration, and there's a lot of baggage and mistrust that has lingered from those times, even though it's a decade ago at this point. So my sense is that you do have some within the administration that would like to see the relationship pivot away from the security-dominated lens that has been the source of so many tensions. There is a desire to move beyond that and focus more on trade cooperation, climate change, and so on. But I think that, ironically, even though the U.S. has left Afghanistan, at least in the immediate term, it's going to continue to look at its relationship with Pakistan through an Afghan lens, through an Afghanistan lens, because of issues like counterterrorism efforts in Afghanistan. I think that the U.S. has not given up on looking into how Pakistan might be able to partner with the U.S. on those efforts, particularly when it comes to going after ISK. And then I think also just because of the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, and Pakistan's geographic location, as well as its relationship with the Taliban, I think that the U.S. will continue to see Pakistan as an important factor for those reasons, and it will want to continue to partner with Pakistan to the extent that it can. But that said, the U.S. traditionally is very impatient about these things. That if it concludes that Pakistan is not helping in ways that it would like it to, vis-a-vis the Afghanistan challenge, then that could cause another blow in the relationship, and it could cause a drifting result. So I hope it doesn't come to that. Looking at some of these achievements in recent months that have nothing to do with security, I think that quad that I referred to before, this quad involving the U.S., Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Uzbekistan, suggests that the U.S. would like to see what the possibilities could be for partnering with Pakistan in a more regional context, particularly on issues like connectivity. That's encouraging, but it's unclear where that quad is going. It's unclear if there's been any substantive takeaways that have come from it. And it was concluded just a few weeks before the Taliban takeover as well. And I think that the U.S. role in that quad may be more limited now that the Taliban is leading the Afghan government. So short answer to your question is, I wish that the relationship could do a pivot away from security and focus on bigger issues away from security, but I think that U.S. policy considerations are such that, at least for the immediate term, that relationship is going to continue to be tethered to the Afghanistan issue.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael. Now we can move to Sher Khan. Sher Khan, you had a question. Please ask quickly and briefly. Thank you.
Yeah, I will try to be quick on this one. So, Michael, you have been approaching both South Asia and the interaction with China from the perspective of democracy. Well, you are an American, and I have lived multiple decades in Canada now. We both know that American and Canadian society are very homogeneous, right? Even the European countries which have democracy, they are very homogeneous. A country like India, where there are multiple ethnicities, languages, religions, a party comes in, wins 36-37% of the popular vote, and makes rules for 100% of the society. So when we are looking India from the lens of democracy, Is it really a democracy? You know, they passed the farms law within 5 or 10 minutes without a debate. So when we are approaching different South Asian countries from the perspective of democracy, are we applying ourselves properly? Because, you know, we are taking sides of one particular country at the cost of others. And the results are pretty damaging. I mean, I'm sorry to be so obsessive about India, but, you know, Pakistan wants to concentrate on women's emancipation. We want this to be a part of our debate. You know, Imran Khan was very clear on the growth issues among the children of Pakistan, right? But we are like, it's just a bitter divorce that we can't get over with India. And when a country like US and analysts like yourself also see it from a democratic perspective without taking into consideration, you know, the attributes of Indian democracy, and making it a silver lining in South Asia, that's the only democratic country there. Doesn't that have an impact and overall outcome on a long-term basis for South Asia?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think that you know, one of the big global trends over the last 2 years has been democratic backsliding. Including in the U.S., quite frankly. And, you know, today, as we know, marks the 1-year anniversary since the siege of the Capitol, which was certainly one of the biggest blows to American democracy in its recent history, or its entire history. And, you know, India is certainly a part of this. But I think that, you know, one has to distinguish between procedural elements of democracy and the principles of democracy. And I think that what we're seeing in many countries, I mean, certainly there have been a number of coups over the last few months. So there have been some major blows to democracy in that sense. But I think that what we're seeing are cases of the procedural elements of democracy continuing to remain in place. You know, elections keep happening, relatively free, relatively fair. But the principles of democracy, such as, you know, pluralism, tolerance for religious minorities, human rights, so forth, that's where the issue is. And, you know, clearly we've seen that in India, particularly in terms of this rising incidence of, you know, not just nasty rhetoric, but outright hate speech, which does not receive any type of response from the government, particularly because in many cases it's government officials themselves that resort to this hate speech. So this is very troubling, for sure, and it points to, I think, what one could describe as you know, a victory of majoritarianism in India at the end of the day. But the implication this has... What's that? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. I'm not talking about the democracy within India. I'm talking about outsiders, like, for example, U.S. foreign policies approach towards Indian democracy. Don't you think that we should be more vocal about the shortcomings, like not only in form of articles about India, but also it should, you know, affect the foreign policy of democratic countries, like, you know, Canada, U.S. and Western countries.
Oh, okay, I see. Yeah, sorry about that. Well, no, I mean, then you get the you know, the hypocrisy argument plays in again, right? I mean, you know, the West is experiencing its own democracy problems, so, you know, one could certainly respond that what right do those countries have to criticize India for its democracy struggles, right? It gets back to what we were discussing before. It's a sign of the times, unfortunately. So I'm not sure. And, you know, one more point on this. You know, many U.S. and Indian officials will talk about how shared values are a major driver of the relationship. And then that could then prompt someone to rightfully say, oh, well, that's absurd, given that, you know, democratic values are very much on the defensive in both of these countries now. But, you know, at the end of the day, I think that's just rhetoric. I think that really the way the U.S. looks at India and vice versa on official levels, it's really seen through the lens of interests, not values. And so I think that sort of, I think it reinforces this point that it's unlikely that you can expect the U.S. and other Western countries to start focusing on India from a democracy lens. I just don't see that as something particularly realistic.
Right. Thank you so much, Michael. Yeah, now we are joined by Mr. Tawfiq Rasam. Yes, please, you can ask your question, sir. And please introduce yourself to Michael as well. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum to everyone, and hello, Michael. This is Tawfiq from New York. Hope you are doing well. I have two questions I'd like to ask. One is why interests are more important than the values when it comes to, especially especially with the U.S. And my second question would be is how do you see Pakistan and United States relationship in 2022, the foreign policy and the relationship?
Well, thanks. I think the second question I've already addressed. I think that we're unlikely to see a broadening and a bettering of the relationship between the U.S. and Pakistan, at least I think for much of the year. I think that the focus will remain on Afghanistan, and so long as that's the case, it's going to be difficult to branch out. You look at what happened last year. There was very, very little high-level engagement between the two countries on issues beyond Afghanistan, beyond terrorism. I believe that the new U.S. trade representative, Bester Tai, I believe she had a call with the Pakistani finance minister, if I'm correct. Not the finance minister, the commerce minister. That was one call. That was great. But, there was a lot of high-level engagement between the two sides, but much of it involved, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, engaging with counterparts and certainly with the army chief in Pakistan and so on. I think that's an indication of the trajectory of the relationship this coming year as well. I just think that's a reality. In terms of your first question, it was a really interesting question that I think is really more of a scholarly question than a policy-focused one that's very difficult to answer. Why the U.S. emphasizes interests over morality and morals in its foreign policy. I think that I can't give you a very good answer to that, other than to say that I think that most U.S. officials conclude that at the end of the day, you need to get things done, and you need to use whatever tactics are necessary to do that, and that humanitarian crises and moral considerations are important, but at the end of the day, you need to take care of your own first, so to speak. You need to do whatever is necessary to improve, to strengthen your interests at home, to strengthen your economy, and so on. And that's your responsibility, and that provides less bandwidth for focusing on some of these major humanitarian crises playing out elsewhere. And the fact that the U.S. is not willing to allocate more bandwidth even to a humanitarian crisis that is very much of its own making, e.g. what happened in Afghanistan, I think that's an indication of the direction that it wants to take. And again, this is not new. I don't want to single out the current administration. This is how it's been for quite some time. But again, this is how the world functions. It's not just how U.S. foreign policy is. I would be curious to know of any country in which moral considerations drive foreign policy as opposed to interest-based calculations. I really can't think of any country in the present day where that would be the case.
All right, thank you, Mike, and we'll try to take one last question from Desi Gump. Go ahead, Desi Gump.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum, everybody, and Mike, thank you for coming over here. And my previous handle was actually suspended due to the known offenders. You may know by my question. Anyway, Mike, I have a question actually. Mike, but I wanted to say something before that question. Mike, if I say that in next 2 years, Michael, I can guarantee you the chances of you winning a lotto, multi-million dollars lotto, is highly unlikely. But at the same time, if I tell you there are highly likely chances that there might be a massacre will occur in India, I would say that statement will be accurate, in my opinion. Now, why I say that? Because if we see that what is going on for the last 70 plus years, in presence of UAPA, Act, which you may aware that it says that the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which is actually, surprise, 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 was actually enacted in 1967 by no other party which we claim to be a progressive or probably left, and that is Congress, Indian National Congress. But here is the point, that we understand, as you said, that in this space, that the many countries, they have a interest, business interest, political interest, that they may not be able to, they don't speak, which is true, even including OIC. I totally agree with you. But you know, Mike, my question to you is, why? I mean, that's fine. The countries, this is the same thing happened in the World War II. Before that, leading up to the World War II, we know that what happened. No country was speaking. Nobody was talking. But what make our left-leaning journalist or independent journalist not to talk, not to tweet, not to remind the world more often about what we are heading towards in India? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I guess sort of a downer of a question to end on. It's a good question. Feel comfortable making predictions about the future, but certainly the trajectory, the trend lines for India, I think, in terms of its social policies, democracy, are not very good at all. I think all the figures in the data are out there that cases of lynchings and cases of communal violence have increased. Not that these didn't happen in previous decades, they did. But the data shows an increase in these types of attacks, and the fact that you have some members of the administration that themselves have used really terrible, have said really terrible things. I mean, thinking of someone like Amit Shah, some of the things that he had said in recent years, very, very troubling. And I think that for me, it's sort of belaboring a point I've already made. It's the silence. That's really what is worrisome. The silence from the government itself, which of course, one could argue could indicate some level of tacit acceptance of all of this, if not more than that. And certainly it's very concerning. But what does that mean in terms of how things could look in a year or two? I don't know. But I do think, getting back to something we discussed at the beginning, is the fact that you've got a series of elections coming up this year. The BJP is going to do everything it can to ensure that it stays in power. If Modi wants to run for another term, which he may, as I said before, that unfortunately this hate sells politically. And that's not only a factor in India, that's a factor in other countries as well. We've seen political figures use hate speech to rally supporters. Very, very dangerous. But I think that this is one thing to really be watching in India, particularly this year, a year when you have so many key state elections. See what comes of that. I'm certainly very concerned as someone who studies India and someone that would like to see things improving in India. But I think that we have to be realistic that it's not looking very good. It's very troubling. I think the question asked is, what could that mean for sitting in Washington, what could this troubling trajectory in India mean for U.S. relations with India? On one level, it doesn't really mean much because the U.S. is not going to change the way it looked at its relationship with India based on the democracy backsliding and so on. But if you were to have, God forbid, large-scale violence breaking out in India, to the point that that's a distraction for the Indian government, makes it difficult to focus on other things, that could impact the ability of the U.S. to work with India on some of these broad global strategic issues that the U.S. wants to focus on. So I'll end there. But bottom line is, it's an important point to bring up, but I don't want to speculate too much. 2 years is a long ways away. But given what we've seen over the last 2 years, what we've seen over the last few weeks, suggests that we all should certainly be concerned about India's trajectory in a domestic context in terms of the Hindutva agenda and everything that comes from that. Very, very troubling.
All right, Mike. Thank you
I have
very
a follow-up
much for
question.
that.
Follow-up question.
Let me ask if he is available for a few more minutes, Mike, or you are welcome to leave, because that's the time commitment we have.
Yeah, I could take one final question, especially because I don't want to leave on such a downer. But yeah, I could definitely take another question.
Oh, sorry, my question will be done.
Desi, why don't you hold your question? We don't want a downer and another one. Let's ask Tawfiq. I think Tawfiq is a really positive guy. Tawfiq,
Mike, it will be I wish you. Let me just take one. Have a question, and then somebody else can just cheer up everybody. Mike, you may aware about that. What happened in the last 48 hours, or probably 24 hours, with the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, was actually kind of a security lapse, or whatever we can say, that which led to kind of not a good taste incident. But my question is, would you agree with my just statement that had there was anything happened to Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, leading the party BJP, wouldn't you agree that this was actually because something really not serious happened? A massacre has been actually just prevented because of that. And if you do not agree, why? And if you agree, could you please let us know that if that is really the fact, that a 1984 kind of situation has been just prevented?
Yeah, quite frankly, I can't really respond just because I myself don't have a full enough sense as to what happened yesterday with that security breach in Punjab. Quite frankly, I don't know, and I know there'll probably be more commentary in the coming weeks. But to the issue of what could happen if something were to happen to the Prime Minister, yeah, obviously that would be very concerning for many different reasons. But quite frankly, since I don't have a full sense, and most of us don't have a full sense as to what really happened, what was behind that incident yesterday in Punjab, I just don't feel comfortable giving a strong answer. But thanks for bringing up the point.
Right. Thank you so much. If we can have one question from Tawfiq Riaz, Michael, with your permission, if you allow. Otherwise, it's all right.
Yeah, sure. That's fine.
Yes, please, Mr. Tawfiq Riaz. You can ask your question, please.
Thank you, Mustafa, and everyone, and thank you, Mike, for taking the question. My question is a kind of a repeat question: interest versus values. I personally believe the journalists and TV anchors globally are not putting the fair share on the table. Do you believe that they are not giving the right information to the of any country you can pick, either it's US, India, Pakistan, or whatever? What do we have to do to filter that out? I think the journalists are supposed to be, I should not say supposed to be, but at least 50% should give us the right information. Why everything is is narrative driven. I mean, it cannot be media house cannot be a business. I know it's a business, but you can't play with human life. So, what is your opinion? Don't you think they need to have a fair share in this role? I think they have a big responsibility.
Sorry, to clarify, who is not giving the full story and picture? I missed the first part of your point. Are you referring to the media?
I was referring to journalists and TV viewers. I'm not picking any country at this time. I think they should give a fair share when they give news and opinions, because journalists and TV anchors, they are very important. They say because millions of people listen, follow them. And
hey, Tawfiq, we are losing you. I think his question is more on journalism generally. So I mean, I don't know if you want to answer that, Mike, but that's not our topic.
Yeah, right. And I'm not actually. Many people think I am a journalist. I'm actually not. I write a column for Foreign Policy, but I'm a think tanker. So yeah, I'm not the best person to answer that, other than to say that we all know that the media and how how media organizations decide what issues are covered. I mean, at the end of the day, it's certainly financial. It's also very political, and there's so many important stories, whether in India or anywhere else, that don't get coverage. And that's why I think that independent media are critical, because you do have, at least in democracies, you have independent media outlets that are willing to take a stronger line on certain issues than some of the the more traditional media. And this is quite clear. And you look in India, some of these web-based outlets like The Wire and Scroll and places like that, those are important outlets, and I think that they oftentimes tell stories that aren't told. And again, you've got counterparts in the U.S., Pakistan, many other countries have that as well. But yeah, sorry, since I'm not a journalist and don't really understand the field, I'm not the best person to respond to that.
Yeah, with that we would like to conclude.
Yeah, thank you. I will ask some other time because.
Yeah, I think you're breaking, Mr. Tawfiq Riaz, so I think probably you need to go somewhere where your voice, more audible than this. Yes, Salman, you can carry on with your stuff, please.
No, I just want to thank Mike once again for his time and for taking so many questions. And Mike, we really appreciate your effort. All we can tell you, this generation of ours, they would like to focus on economic growth, more opportunities for the South Asians, and yeah, hopefully that would save the United States from a lot of immigrants as well, right? If the right decisions are made at the right time. So, any final words, the co-host or the hosts or the panelists?
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. I just want to say thank you to Michael Kugelman for being so, kind and giving so much time, and especially for answering a lot of questions, which are quite complicated at the moment, but maybe the picture will clear in coming days or months. But still, he answered them quite well. So I must say thanks for his time and his effort and information as well, which he shared with us. Thank you so much, Michael. Yes, Muneeb.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate what Salman and Mustafa said. Just want to thank Mike, and these have been really good conversations with you, Mike, and hopefully we can continue on that and keep coming up with the good articles that you have been writing, especially the ones that are against India, because we love those ones. So thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you soon.
Yes, Sadia, you want to add something, please?
Thank you, Mike. This was very illustrious, and just want to reiterate the fact that Pakistan wants a good relationship with the United States. As far as trade is concerned, we want to be successful. We want both the countries to be successful. So I read your articles on a daily basis regularly, and very impressive. And you've truly answered all the questions very adeptly, and we appreciate it to us. Thank you for being here.
Well, thanks a lot. appreciate that. I hope that the next year will be more healthy and more prosperous for South Asia and for my country as well, for that matter, and everywhere else. So thanks for having me. Great questions. And a real shout out to the host and the co-host. I learned the hard way recently that it's actually very difficult to host a space session. It's an art. So you guys did it very well. So thank you all, and look forward to doing it again another time soon.
Thanks a lot, Mike. So as for the other,
we look forward to seeing you again.
Yeah. So I can see still a lot of requests for the mic.
जी नाज़रीन, आई होप कि आपको वीडियो और ये स्पेस काफ़ी पसंद आई होगी। नाज़रीन, अगेन मैं खराज तहसीन पेश करना चाहूँगा मुस्तफ़ा भाई को, सलमान भाई को, मुनीब भाई को, कि उन्होंने इतनी ज़बरदस्त स्पेस कंडक्ट की, और मैं होपफुल हूँ कि इंशाअल्लाह ताला नेक्स्ट भी वो ऐसी स्पेसेस करते रहेंगे जिसमें ऐसे ही वो मेहमानों को बुलवाएंगे और पाकिस्तानी ज़बरदस्त और मुश्किल तरीन सवालात उनसे करेंगे, ताकि आवाम को जो नॉलेज है, जो बेहतरीन इंफॉर्मेशन है, वो मिलती रहे। नाज़रीन, अल्लाह पाक मुझे, आपको, हम सब को आसानियाँ अता फरमाए और हमें आसानियाँ तकसीम करने का भी शर्फ अता फरमाए। इंशाअल्लाह ताला नेक्स्ट फिर मुलाकात होगी। अल्लाह हाफिज़। अस्सलाम वालेकुम।